Well, hello there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm your host, Cindy Watson, and I'm really excited to introduce you today to Roberta Grimes. Welcome, Roberta. It's so great to have you here today.
I'm delighted to be here, Cindy. So good to see you again.
Yes, likewise. And for our listeners and our viewers out there, roll up your sleeves because it is going to be an interesting kind of dynamic conversation. I think we're going to be talking about negotiating past dogma. And all of you know who are regular listeners or subscribers to this podcast, I am all about the fact that all of life is a negotiation. And the more we can up-level our skills, the better life we can have. Make sure to grab a copy of my book, The Art of Feminine Negotiation, How to Get What You Want from the Boardroom to the Bedroom. Now, Roberta, for those of you who don't know, Roberta Grimes is a business attorney and also a gospel scholar and an expert on death and the afterlife. So a really broad range of interests. And we're going to be touching a little bit on each of those here today. So let's dig right in. Roberta, I knew this was likely to be a risky or at least controversial potential topic and episode. But, I really felt drawn that with the increasing polarization in the world and your beautiful approach to these subjects that you're interested in, I thought it was really worth tackling. Everybody these days seems so certain about the correctness of their position that there's seems to be no room left for open dialogue. So before we dive into sort of the religion piece of it, I'd love your views maybe more generally on some tips on how to negotiate to influence and persuade with difficult subjects where people really are entrenched in their beliefs. What are some of your thoughts around that?
Every negotiation that I've ever been involved in every area has a hook. And that hook is always sooner in every area based in love. If you can find the love angle, you can always make it work.
Oh, that's
and most of every business I've worked with has been a family business in some way or another. There's been a family ownership angle. And so dealing with a family and I'm dealing with a business. And with the family usually every family is dysfunctional in one way or another. And so I have to dig into the family and find the dysfunction. And usually it's somewhere based around the mother. And if, everybody loves the mother, even though maybe they hate each other.
Yeah.
And sometimes they think they hate the mother, but they really don't. They all love the mother.
Phew.
So, yes. And so I kind of usually get to know the mother and we figure out how loving the mother is going to fix the problem. And that's where we go.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's great that you talk about the dysfunction. I mean, we often sort of sweep under the cover. And as soon as you said the word, my mind immediately went like all the ways in which, growing up, all of the various dysfunctions of our family. So I think it is definitely true. And those families that don't acknowledge that, I think do so at their peril. I want to circle back when you said love. I find that a really interesting concept. And, I think a lot of people would think, well, that's kind of woo-woo, especially these days in negotiations. Everybody brings that very chest beating approach. It's one of the reasons that I created The Art of Feminine Negotiation. I feel we have so bought into a competitive mode. So I really quite like this idea about love. Can you speak a little bit more to that? How you mean, like, how can we bring that or touch in on that, even when people are having those difficult discussions about politics, for example, where we're seeing such polarization, or even as much as it's risky again with the recent COVID, where, you had two legitimate positions at either end of the spectrum, but nobody was able to have that conversation. I can see a lot of ways where approaching it with a loving sort of perspective could make a difference.
Men are at a disadvantage. Women have such a huge advantage because women are allowed to talk about love.
Yeah.
Men don't seem to feel entitled to talk about love. And yet in every case, love is at the base of everything we do.
Yeah.
Women need to use that. It's like they've got this secret club that they can beat everybody over the head with, and it's fair game for women to use it.
Yeah. It's a beautiful secret weapon. And it's interesting you say women, because I think, at least for me, we've made it such a gender-based thing, but I can't wait until the time when we reframe how we look at this so that both men and women feel, comfortable and entitled to tap into that love. I've never framed it that way, but I really like this idea about love. And I'm just thinking, as you say that, even like on the COVID piece, on both sides of the spectrum, if people brought that love and appreciation to the other perspective.
Yes.
I mean, I can appreciate that this this side, if you will, is really concerned about protecting individual rights and freedoms. And I can understand why that's important to them and come from that place of love and compassion. And at the other side, I can understand why protecting public safety is something they feel so profoundly about. I think that love approach, you're on to something there, Roberta. I think that's fabulous. I love it.
It's a great secret weapon, and I've been using it for my entire legal career. And I just think that it's so powerful because there's no, whoever is on the other side of the argument has no weapon to use against it. It always wins. Love always wins.
Yeah. And how does that show up? Like as a business attorney, or well, in any, you can use whatever example you want, but as a practical matter, just for our listeners, like, are you talking about just feeling that love and coming from it yourself, or does it show up in the language even that you use when you're negotiating? How did that show up for you?
Well, for example, I recently worked in a family where things had been allowed to get quite far down the road, and everybody thought they were right, and everybody thought everybody else was wrong, and everybody was very angry. And therefore, they could not move ahead toward what they all wanted to do, which was to pass the business to the next generation. And when I made it all about what would make the mother happy, we all turned around and looked at what would make the mother happy. And suddenly it became relatively easy to try to frame it about what would make the mother happy. And then suddenly it became a much easier set of steps to take toward what would make the mother happy. And they stopped focusing on what they were angry about in one another and began to look at the steps that they could take toward what would make the mother happy. And when they focused on that, it became, the steps that they needed to take became easier, and it all began to look positive toward one another, because the focus was off one another, if you see what I mean. It changed,
totally.
it reframed everybody's argument. And then when we began to look at the steps we were taking, it began to all, within months, everything was reframed.
Yeah.
And then we looked again at what we were doing. It just, the whole focus changed.
Yeah. There's so much packed in what you're saying there. I think first, when that ego, right? Surrendering the ego and making it about the others, which is so important. And also, as you were saying that, it really struck me, it's that collaboration. Suddenly they went away from that competitive model, and you were able to bring it around.
Who can do the most for mom?
To be collaborative. Beautiful. But also, when we're talking about love, I really like this idea, because to me that resonates. It's finding, like, you're finding the point of love for them, which is even a different approach than I had thought when you first mentioned it. It's like finding that deep why in any negotiation. Find their deep why, find that thing that they love, what matters to the other party, and that changes everything. I think that's beautiful. And what are the key reasons that you think negotiations fail?
Mainly, they fail because whoever is running the negotiation, whoever is the person who is leading the negotiation, does not help people to reframe the negotiation properly. If we allow people only to see it from their own perspective and not to step back and look at the larger picture, then it's impossible. And there is a larger picture.
Yeah.
We have to help people see it.
Yeah. And I love that. I think that's great advice. So for our listeners out there, when you're in a negotiation, if the other person is not looking at the bigger picture, it's incumbent on you to do that, right? Find that bigger picture, find that more collaborative, broader angle. And what are some of the things, or, sort of skills or hallmarks that you think make a great negotiator? I mean, you've already touched on some, being able to show up with that, sort of releasing ego and showing up from that more collaborative place, showing up from a place of love. And I find that also particularly effective when dealing with bullies. Now that, as you mentioned that, Roberta, I think that's always a great strategy. If you can think about something, we all have hardship in our life, and just trying to tap into that piece of the other person, something where you can send love to, I think is great. So what are some of the other skills that you think will make for better negotiators?
Whenever you come into a place where everybody is in a hardened position, there's always a bully. There's always somebody who has frozen everybody else's position by making it impossible for for the negotiation to go forward. And you always have to disarm that person.
Mhm.
Usually, if in my family situations, it's always the grandfather or the father or the whoever was the person who held all the power. Often it's the person who owns all the stock.
Yeah.
You know, whoever that person is, he makes it impossible to fix the problem. And I always have to disarm that person.
Yeah.
And I do it. I find a way to do it.
I like that a lot. And can I often talk about that different. I think we've been so conditioned to frame power based on power over others rather than power with others. And I think it's such an important reframe. What are some ways you do that, if you don't mind sharing? Not to put you on the spot, but when you say you find a way, can you think off the top of any examples where you've sort of reframed to diffuse that sort of power? Because most conflict comes from a sense of lack of power. So what are some ways that you find effective to reframe that power dynamic?
How do you get rid of the power in the hands of the person who has all the power? It depends on whatever. Usually the reason he has frozen the family in impossible situations because he's afraid.
Yeah.
He's afraid of his own mortality. He's afraid that if he allows the situation to go forward and he gives up control, the family will do bad things to him in some way. So I find out what he's afraid of, and I show him how I can give him contractual control once he's given up. Whatever he's afraid of, I show him how he doesn't have to be afraid of it anymore.
Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful. And gosh, it's so funny. I knew I was going to click because so much of what you say resonates with sort of the models that I believe in. One of my models, I call it the no fear model. And it's about tapping into what are the fears the other side's bringing to the table, and what fears am I bringing, and how can we diffuse that or use it? What the E is for ego, right? Well, how can we diffuse this? Get rid of my ego.
That's the first thing we have to do. Once they know what, basically, I say whatever you are afraid of. I don't say it in these words, but I help him to see whatever he's afraid of.
Yeah.
I can take away his fear. He can trust me to do that. Once he trusts me, because he brought me into it in the first place, because he's tired of being afraid.
Yeah.
So once he trusts me, then he goes, ah, and he relaxes, and we were able to solve the whole thing. We solved the whole problem.
And for our listeners and our viewers there, I want to really be putting a pin in this for you, because the language that we're hearing today that marks successful negotiators and negotiations is love, compassion, surrender of ego, right? I mean, all of this language that we do not typically associate with negotiations. And that's where the key is when you get to the heart of it. So I love that. And let's dig right in now. I think, Roberta, we sort of set a tone here. People have got a bit of a sense of you. So let's speak to the elephant in the room. You're a gospel scholar. And well, first, I'd love you to tell us what started you on that journey. And what insights did you get about the impact of dogma and how maybe we can overcome it or challenge it?
Well, when I was 8 years old, I woke up in the middle of the night and I knew there was no God. And suddenly, and I was terrified because I was a good little Christian child. And so then there was a flash of white light in my room, and I heard a voice say, you wouldn't know what it is to have me unless you knew what it is to be without me. I will never leave you again. So I thought, oh, that's nice. If you forget there's a God, they remind you that there's a God. So I went right back to sleep. And I assumed that was normal. If you forget there's a God, they remind you. But I never learned what that light was or where the voice had come from. So I ended up majoring in religion in college, figuring that when you get to college, they'll tell you what that light is. So eventually I ended up investigating the afterlife. I figured somewhere I'm going to find out what that was. And eventually, after 50 years of research, I figured it out myself. And that's why I ended up being an afterlife scholar as well.
And well, let's just touch on that since we're here now. What did you discover, that sort of white light, if you want to call it, or whatever it is? What was your conclusion around that?
That was my spirit guide. We all have a spirit guide. who helps us plan our lifetime. And my spirit guide wanted me to know that he was there. And so
Yeah.
he gave me this experience of light, which is, it's rarer, much rarer than a near-death experience, but it's what's called a spiritually transformative experience. And I had it when I was a child. That's kind of a shocking thing.
That's remarkable.
But they're in the Bible. I mean, Moses with his burning bush, that was a spiritually transformative experience like mine. And the road to Damascus, Saul on the road to Damascus, when he became the Apostle Paul, he was knocked and struck blind temporarily when Jesus spoke to him out of a white light and said, why are you persecuting me?
Yeah.
And I mean, that was the same kind of experience I had.
Yeah.
They're rare, but they do happen.
Okay.
And
no, thank you for sharing that. I think that is highly unusual. And I think a lot of people get very skeptical about it, but sometimes a lot of the science is now catching up on things that people have been skeptical about. Now, when we talk about religion, I mean, religion is certainly one of those very polarizing, they always often say, don't talk about religion or politics. I forget what the third one is, but I know you and religion.
Probably that's enough.
Has killed more people, I think, through history in some ways than it is saved, because people get so entrenched in the dogma of it and the certainty of their position. It's always interested me, because when I step back, most core religions in the world share the same fundamental sort of precepts about what the religion is supposed to be based on, the principles, and yet just such ferocious fighting. So I know you've concluded, or correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you've concluded that Jesus didn't actually intend to start religion, but quite the opposite. So I'd love if you could speak to that briefly, and what's that determination based on?
Yes, Jesus never came to start any religion. He came to abolish religions and teach us to relate to God individually. And that's pretty clear from the Gospels. But he started, in fact, a spiritual movement which thrived, had millions of followers by the year 300. And then the Roman Emperor Constantine decided he could use what Jesus had founded. So he destroyed Jesus's movement, and he started his own fear-based religion in the year 325. And at the First Council of Nicaea, what Constantine began was the religion which we now call Christianity, and kept the name of Jesus, but none of Jesus's teachings, which actually survive inside the Bible that Constantine put together, but the teachings of Jesus did not survive. They're inside the Bible, but are not preserved at all in the dogmas of Christianity.
Interesting. And how do you approach your discussions with, the devout who maybe are closed to other perspectives? How do you navigate or negotiate those discussions to be able to have an open, meaningful dialogue with the ability to potentially influence or persuade?
I don't even try to persuade people. I don't need to, because the fact that the religion is so wrong is pretty obvious to sophisticated Christians. Christians have been coming to me for the past, ever since I began to speak publicly about 20 years ago. People started coming to me and saying, I want Jesus, I don't want the religion anymore. I can't believe the religion anymore. And so they basically come to me. I don't need to go to them.
Okay. And where do you think everything went so wrong then, Roberta, right? How did, what happened that things went so far off course?
Well, Constantine was looking for a way to subjugate the masses. Understand that what we believe is a solid reality around us isn't solid at all. It's actually consciousness, which scientists still don't understand at all, is an energy. Max Planck, who is the father of quantum mechanics, he got the 1918 Nobel Prize, said that we can't, he could not get behind consciousness. You can't get behind consciousness because it's really all that exists. And at its lowest vibration, it's an energy vibrates. At its lowest vibration, it's fear-based. at its highest vibration, it's love-based. You'll get love again. You can't get away from love. It's basic. And Constantine used fear. His religion is fear-based.
Yeah.
And that's how he keeps people in line. And religion, all religions are fear-based. That's how they keep people in line. And Christianity is fear-based.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the teachings of Christianity are all fear-based. I mean, when I walk into my husband's church, my poor husband is still a Catholic, and you can imagine how he feels about his wife's belief. Oh my goodness. We've been married for 50 years, so it hasn't broken up our marriage, but it certainly has been an interesting marriage, I must say. But I walk into his church, and there is this life-size, full-color plaster Jesus bleeding on a cross above the altar. I mean, imagine and doing that to save us from our sins.
Yeah.
What makes you feel more guilty than that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you think of the purging of the so-called witches, right? I mean, as a way as well. So you just said something though that really tweaked for me when you talked about your personal relationship. And thank you for being so vulnerable. I love when conversations, I think it allows us to go a little deeper, because I'm a big believer that all of life is a negotiation, whether it's with our kids or our intimate partner, multi-million-dollar business deals, whether it's negotiating against dogma. So I'm loving this conversation because we're kind of getting a little bit of everything here. So but because religion can be such a touchy subject, I mean, there is such deep conditioning and guilt, as you say, some fear around it. When you're in the most intimate relationship, how do you negotiate or navigate in your relationship those kind of profound differences, if you don't mind sharing?
Well, when he first discovered that I was researching the afterlife, he told me I was going to hell. That
Okay.
and it sort of went uphill from there. No, he has broadened his outlook quite a bit since then. He then began asking me questions. Now he complains to me when, he thinks the sermons in his church are rather shallow, which they are, and he complains about the priests. But no, it's hard when people are in the clutches of a religion which tells them that if they eat meat on Friday, they are going to purgatory or going to hell. It's hard. Once you are in the clutches of Christianity from childhood, you cannot get out of those clutches. It's very hard. And I empathize with him very much. I was not a cradle Catholic, so I was able to escape.
Yeah. Although a lot of people are shifting now, I think even pre-COVID, but certainly post-COVID. But I think we've seen this steady, if you look at the numbers, people seem to be moving away from organized religion or institutionalized religion and more in search of spirituality in a different sense. So
yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. In 1970, 91% of Americans were Christians. By 2022, it was, I think the number is 36%. Huge drop. And the Pew Research Center says that will be 26% by 2070. So yes, but people who are cradle Catholics are finding it very hard to leave ever, because there's always that little suspicion that there just might be a hell, even though I've told him, dear, you don't have to worry. It's very hard.
Yeah.
There still might be, she might be wrong. So
well, the fear of unknown can be a powerful thing in any negotiation, frankly, whether the stakes are that high, whether we're talking heaven or hell, or even just in a typical business deal, that fear of what if this happens? What if that? Those things that we don't know can end up being paralyzing, end up making it very difficult to navigate the discussion. And for our listeners out there, just want to be really clear as well. This isn't necessarily about any one religion. The point is about how do we open the space to be able to have meaningful discussions so that we can question the things that we take as sacrosanct. And I love, Roberta, that you talk about that idea, because it so transcends even religion, although a lot of this was religious based too. But we for many, many generations believed as an irrefutable fact that the earth was flat. We persecuted people. The church persecuted people who believed
Yep.
something different. The idea that the earth would rotate around the sun was seen as preposterous proposition, right? So things that we assume we know with absolute certainty may not be so. And quantum physics has been an absolute game changer in that. Now, is anything we believe to be accurate even real, or is it all just energy that may or may not matter? So that kind of does take us a little bit to the afterlife, which, as you can imagine, we don't typically talk about on this podcast. But since I've got you with some expertise on that, I'd love your thoughts on, as an expert on death and the afterlife, does that have any impact on how you negotiate or how you show up in life?
Well, yeah, I mean, hugely. But I'm a skeptic by nature. I think you have to be if you're going to be a serious researcher in any area, because if you are not a skeptic, you'll believe anything. And I'm very skeptical. So when I first got out of college, it was not until Raymond Moody's 1976 book, Life After Life, that we began to really get serious books about the afterlife. And I discovered that in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was a flood of good information that came through deep trance mediums. Late 19th, early 20th century, there were good mediums. Good mediums would go into trance, and their controls would be speaking to people who actually had your dead loved ones with them. And much, much more effective than mind reading with dead people, which I don't believe in. I mean, I'm sorry, I really don't believe in that. I can't, to me, that's just too speculative. But these deep trance mediums it was a very effective way to communicate with people that we used to think were dead. Yeah. And there'd be very effective communications with people who had just died. There would be in the room people who loved these people who had just died, and we would get very detailed communications about what it was like where these people who had just died had ended up. Yeah. And these communications were received in southern England and in the eastern United States, in New York City, around in the environs primarily, and in the Boston area. Hundreds and hundreds of these communications were received, and they were received by researchers who were in the room and able to record in detail what was being received. And these researchers thought they were doing cutting edge science, which is very important. Yeah. Books were written, and we're talking, I know I look very, very young, but we're talking the 70s. Yeah. I was looking for these books right out of college. Yeah. And they were in used bookstores. You could find these books for pennies on what used to be dollars. Yeah. And now they're, who knows. But I haunted these used bookstores, bought a lot of these books, and read hundreds and hundreds of these communications. Yeah. And after 2 years of reading all these communications, none of them were copied. They were all unique. Yeah. And yet every single one of them was coming from what looked like the same place. I say in my book, The Fun of Dying, it was like reading hundreds of communications from people who had all been to Fiji. I'm going to go to Fiji one day. I want to know what it's like there. But they'd all been to the same place. It was all the same process, the same physics, the same pastimes, the same kinds of clothing, the same details.
Yeah, gets tough.
It was the same.
It's very tough to dismiss when you're having that. And it's interesting. And you say, as soon as you started speaking about that, I thought, like, my dad died way too young, 30 years ago. And, he was way too young. I knew he was young at the time, but then when I hit the marker, I was like, oh my gosh, that's young. But I certainly would have loved to have had the opportunity to have some communication, let me tell you. So I think people are skeptical until the need arises for them personally, and then they desperately want to be able to have that sort of belief. And I want to reframe when you talk about skepticism for our listeners out there as well. I really invite you especially in these times where we're seeing such polarization, whether in politics about the, quantum physics versus, our traditional conditioning, issues like COVID that arose where we see such polarization. And even in your day-to-day negotiations, just really invite you to be curious. I mean, the word skepticism is loaded for a lot of people, so maybe just substitute it with curiosity. So be curious yourself. Don't accept everything you read. Don't accept everything you hear. Ask questions, get curious. And in negotiations, when you're having these difficult conversations, whether it's around politics or religion, ask questions, surrender your ego and get curious. I call it the art of fascination. So I really love, Roberta, that you talk about that idea of approaching with skepticism. Now, I can't resist asking, and I don't know if this is within your expertise, but because I know you're an expert on death and the afterlife, I know that negotiating end of life for loved ones can be you talk about dysfunction in families, it can rip families apart. It can be such a challenging area. I wonder if you have any insights about negotiating end of life.
I'm a hard person to talk to about end of life, because the way I feel about it is, yay, lucky you, look at you, aren't you? I'm so excited for you, because let me tell you about where you're going. Yeah. This is so exciting for you. You know who you're going to see there. Yeah. And I'm so happy and excited for you. That's how I feel about end of life.
Oh, that's a nice approach. I think that's a beautiful approach. We are such a a death phobic society. I think
I know it's terrible and stupid. Yes. Because it's the best, the best day of your life. The best day of your life is the day you die, because suddenly, you know what? In the upper corners of the room, you suddenly see your mother, and your mother looks younger than you ever saw her when you were, because she looks the way she looked the day you were born. Yeah. You don't remember how she looked then, do you?
Yeah. Well, a friend of mine, Yvonne Heath, wrote a book called Love Your Life to Death, and it talked about how death phobic we are as a society and things we ought to do to be able to change it. So, well, I used to have longer podcasts and I was told to shorten them. I can't believe how quick our time has gone here, Roberta. This has been such an interesting, you've got such a wealth of knowledge. It's tough to pack it all in. So I normally love to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? Doesn't have to be on this issue. It can be on anything, but one of those aha moments that changes how you think about something or how you show up.
When I was around 50 years old, my mother-in-law, when who was 40 years older than I, she was 90. She looked at me and she said, Bobby, which is what my nickname was. I'm going to tell you something. She said, I don't feel any older right now than you do. Mm. You need to understand that when you're 90, you aren't going to feel any older than you feel right now. So don't let yourself ever feel older than you feel today.
Wow.
She said that to me.
That is such great advice. Oh my God.
And I said, I was shocked. But I took her advice, and you know what? I don't feel any older today when I'm in my 70s than I felt that day.
Yeah.
She was right.
Gosh, you do look fabulous. Good grief. So, and that's so good. I'm smiling here from ear to ear because my husband is always like, oh, you're only as old as you feel. So I figure I'm still about 17, or sometimes he'll say 25, right? But he definitely.
No, I feel like I'm in my 40s, but I'm not. I'll soon be twice that age.
Yeah. No, I think that's a beautiful approach. And that's a great mindset shift for all our listeners out there. I hope you embrace that and take it into your heart. There have been so many nuggets here today. So Roberta, tell our listeners and our viewers, where can they learn more about you? And tell us a bit about your books too.
They can go to robertagrimes.com. I blog every week and my blog posts are there. Our other websites are seekreality.com. teachingsbyjesus.com. I also have a podcast, which is 10 years old.
Nice. You're ahead of the curve.
At webtalkradio.net. And my podcast is Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes. Actually, you can find it, Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes, just about anywhere that podcasts are found. And that's just about it.
That's awesome. And we'll make sure to put those all in the show notes. So for our listeners, don't panic if you miss that. re-listen to the episode, or you could just go to the show notes as well and check that out. And I invite you to check out. We didn't get a chance to really dig into some of the sort of religious piece here as much as I would like. We'll have to have you back to go a level deeper on that, Roberta.
Anytime, because I love talking to you.
Yes,
You are just the
likewise.
best, I must say.
I love that. Thank you. And I think there are some really great insights. I've read some of the stuff that Roberta's put out there, and it really does cause you to take pause and think. And I hope for our listeners, that's a message you're really taking away today, is when you find yourself really stuck on something, when you find yourself so convinced with absolute certainty about the rightness of your position, I invite you to pause, take a breath, and intentionally go out seeking alternative views, right? Get a little curious with yourself and allow yourself to be and stay curious in those discussions. It's the only way we're going to bridge the polarization we're seeing today, is when we open ourselves up to have some of these discussions with an open mind. You don't have to agree with the other party, but at least be open to bring empathy to the table to understand. So thank you so much, Roberta, for sharing your insights with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you.
I love it. I love it. Whatever the question, love is always the answer.
I love that. And again, thank you for reminding that, because that is absolutely the overriding message that I hope you took away today, because you can't go wrong in life, whether you're dealing with a difficult situation, with a difficult person, with a difficult issue, when you've got those difficult negotiations, being able to show up from a place of love, both unconditional love for yourself, but find a way to determine what matters and what the other person really loves, but also show up with that compassion and love for them, frankly. We're all human. We all have our human foibles, and we all have our hurts that we carry with us. So showing up from that place of compassion, I believe, is a game changer. So I am sure you have all got loads of value from this episode. Please subscribe if you haven't done that, and make sure to share this with anyone that you think could get some value from the message. And again, in this polarized world, this message is really important. So please check it out. And before we sign off today, just wanted to share some ways we can work together. If you're looking to up-level your negotiation skills, which I suggest everybody needs to, because all of life is a negotiation. If you want to negotiate your best life, I've got everything from online to group to my signature mastermind or VIP experiences available to help you leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. And if that sounds interesting, check out theartoffemininenegotiation.com, or as I say, check out our book, theartoffemininenegotiation.com, how to get what you want from the boardroom to the bedroom. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms, so you stop missing out and get more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.